Hello, nice to see you this morning, I don't know, afternoon, maybe. We are honored to have you, and I'm honored to have my distinguished guest here, Joanna Walsh. Applause. Applause, applause. She's many things at once, and we are going to talk about it too in virtual and the real world. So of course, so-called. And she's a multidisciplinary writer for print, digital, and performance, author of 7 books, including Hotel, Vertigo, Worlds from the World's End, and Breakup. And she also works as a critic, editor, teacher, and arts activist. She is a UK Arts Foundation Fellow and the recipient of Markievicz Award in the Republic of Ireland. She founded and ran Read Women, which is very interesting. I would hope that we will talk about it too. Described by the New York Times as a rallying cry for equal treatment of women writers. And currently runs No Entry Odds. But our main hero or heroine is a book, Girl Online. And unless you want to start with something else, I think that's great to show the words, to hear your book. So if you'd be so kind as to read a fragment, an excerpt.
I will, thank you.
This book is actually a great hybrid work of art. It includes many styles and genres of literature at the same time, but there is one thing that's important throughout the book, the voice of a woman or a girl. And
yeah, I like to be, I'm very interested in playing with these different identities and in which the way that they have been made into a binary and set against each other, which of course is something that I want to discuss. So
because it's patriarchal.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I want to talk about the experience of people who go online and who work through or adopt a feminine persona. I wanted to talk about the kind of way that the kind of girl figure is posited as an experience through which you can attain certain kinds of attention, even some certain kinds of income, whereas the status of the woman online is more shaky. The idea of the woman is often constrained to online things to do with responsibility, work, motherhood, and of course the people who go online are often and simultaneously both these things. And if so, how can they make that work for them in these constrained identities which are offered to us to inhabit, which of course we can break and mold, but that's very difficult. It's very difficult to work against a whole culture of stereotypes, but possibly we can use them. I'm talking also a lot about my personal experience of being online, which has been very much as a user. I'm not. I have recently learned to do some coding, and I've been working with artificial intelligence. But on the whole, since I guess the early 2000s, I've been there as a participant on social media. I've used it for various projects, but I haven't until recently delved into, how the internet actually works. So I wanted to write a personal history of the online user, which has certainly been my status, and what can we do with that?
But the user in particular being you.
Yeah, yes, or being, I like to work from my own experience because I don't want to appropriate other people's experiences, but I hope from that experience to be able to talk about wider issues. So in this bit, which you asked me to read, which I'm interested in, it's really about the idea of the confessional and the idea that when that the feminine persona online has often been confessional. It's been about revelation. It's the idea of the blog as a diary and the diary as something that is secret or personal or private, and thinking about the valences of those words and what it can mean when that privacy comes into the public realm. So this kind of era, the late 2000s, when I started really making projects online, was also the era of the blog. And of course, now the blog has been It's gone its way, and we've had kind of micro-blogging platforms, and then things like Substack and more visual platforms like Instagram, Be Real. So it's interesting to think that that was a particular moment in time when all these sort of these styles that came from offline publishing, journalism, telejournalism, book publishing, magazine publishing, just sort of leaked into the internet and what the internet made of them. And they were particularly feminized forms often. So anyway,
that's true. That's true.
More ado, I'll read
guys, maybe a quick question. Who's familiar with Sex and the City series?
Oh yeah, okay. So
great.
There will be some mentions, but this is, yeah. This is not heavy on the Sex and the City bit, but I could read that bit later anyway.
Whatever you like.
Okay, I'll read this bit now.
Yes.
About the diary. So it's a little mini essay. My book is made up of mini essays so that I can take many different angles and points of view and deal with many different issues. And this one is called I Confess. I confess that beginning to write online and feeling little agency myself, I sought a literary agent. Should I write a book? And what sort? You write about cities, she said, and love. You should write chick lit. This was the late 2000s, the era of the blog novel, the real as fiction. A woman had just made a fortune turning her blog into a book, and so, said the agent, this is what I should write. Looking for examples, I should not read Augustine's Confessions or Montaigne's essays. I should read a blogger who called herself Petite Anglaise. Seeking, like Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City, to recognise myself in something outside myself, I looked up the blog. If chick lit was cute, this was not cute. It was brutal. The feelings were terrifying. A single mother abroad, diary entries at 4 a.m, despair couched as cheerily as it could be written, rom-com style, peeling off raw content. It did not only splash itself with its own reflection, it nearly drowned in it. I read it and I was horrified. Had what Chris Kraus called the Roman clay, the thinly veiled story of me, got mixed up with the story of O. On the cover of the novel is Catherine Sanderson's blog name, Petite Anglaise, which is also the book's title. Below it, her name in real life, splitting her into writer and subject. Then, in smaller letters, the words, a true story. The reviewers on Amazon do not evaluate Sanderson's writing, but herself. I really disliked Catherine, and thus I can't say I enjoyed the book. Just as the critical reviewers on IMDb do not like the fictional Sex and the City because they do not like the characters' morals, and they do not like the characters personally. They also complain that the women's lives and finances are unrealistic, and many prefer The Sopranos, another HBO show of the same era about male mafiosos whose glamorous lifestyles are the fruit of extortion and murder. The reviewers do not like that Sanderson's was a true story. They would, they say, have preferred fiction. She is not a real writer because she draws too much on real life. They know it's her life because it's on her blog, and blogs are real. They suspect each unpleasant or morally questionable incident to have taken place in the life of the author exactly as it was written in the novel, and to splash back on her. They expected something lighter, and Sanderson's book makes them uncomfortable. It is not chick lit, they complain. This may be complaint as diversity work. This is something that the critic Sara Ahmed has formulated. Halted by the recognition of the woman who's splashed by the dirt of her own image, the reader is forced to think not only, what if that really happened, but also, if so, how do I feel about knowing it did? This not only, quotes, tolls the knell of genealogy or of genericity, Derrida, but bursts the division between art and ethics, offline and off, online and off, reality and fiction. At the point of deciding Petite Anglaise's genre, Amazon readers are faced with a textual aporia, a transfixing question posed by someone pretending to be perplexed. And their complaints and defences are impassioned. A work in a new genre, which could be called the blog novel, Petite Anglaise admits its relation to life. So its readers do not complain about how Sanderson writes. They complain about single mothers, or complain about the way single mothers are treated. They complain about women who have casual sex, or about the men who exploit them. They complain about or defend the way women treat their friends, their husbands, their children, their colleagues. They complain about the way women treat themselves. Quote, the effect of the medium is made strong and intense just because it is given another medium as content. The book is a private confessional form that provides a point of view. The press is a group confessional form that provides communal participation. This was Marshall McLuhan writing in the 1960s. Update. The diary used to be a private form. Then it became press. But only just, part of the semi-amateur first-person industrial complex that paid mostly women writers, mostly very little and sometimes nothing at all for everything they'd got. The diary used to be for thoughts that were unspeakable. The blog made it about sharing them with as many people as possible. The digital diary put on screen the screened-off private self. Good. Privacy was seldom good for women. In its name, it has been, it still is, the location of crimes committed against them. Private is often not private for women, but women being private for others. The control of women's privacy has too seldom been in their hands, and private life has sometimes meant that women have been private property. Carey, Calloway and Sanderson, or Petite, characters of different and mixed levels of fictionality, using different genres amongst the girl genres known as genre, claimed their diaries as their own private property and sold them. Yeah. A girl's diary is a think, autocorrect, with an artificial lock, which points up that it has an inside and an outside, but that's all show. You can break into it easily if leaving evidence. A girl is free to refuse the gift of a diary with its heart-shaped lock, but she may find no other paper to write on. Why give diaries to girls, but not to boys? A girl must be something where secrets are kept. But a girl who keeps a diary is also assumed to be innocent. So what secrets would she write? A kept woman is paid for her privacy. Sanderson, like Calloway, like Carey, kept a diary and then it kept her. It was an account of herself that was entered into her end-of-year accounts. And I can't help but wonder, how can a girl give an account of herself in all innocence? And what happens when the personal, the private, the amateur insists that it is work?
These are great questions, and I think this, let's say, a huge question of how diary works for women, especially. I think it's an age-old question. While you were reading, I was thinking about Sylvia Plath and her confessional lyrics and how she's undermined by the critics because, it's private, that's confessional, it's about emotions, it's not real poetry.
This is like Joanna Russ's book, How to suppress women's writing. And one of the excuses is it's personal and so therefore it's not real writing.
Yeah, and trivial.
The personal, the amateur is something that's devoid of art or indeed artificiality or artfulness. Whereas in fact, we know that these forms are actually highly codified already. Anyone who's read diary literature, I found that a lot of the blogs written in the 2000s resembled not necessarily intimate personal thoughts, but diary structures which were already there for us, including, the very popular Bridget Jones's diary, and of course Sex and the City, which was, around just before the era of blogging began. And these were people's models because, where else do people get their models from?
It's true. So what you were saying is that online blogs or diaries were very subversive because they were previously told and made known by a woman who's not innocent anymore, but is having a diary that she shouldn't. And at the same time, she shouldn't tell everyone, but she does. So it's very revolutionary when you look at it like that.
Yes, and I found that a lot of the blogs, there was a huge variety of blogs around at the time, but some of them crossed boundaries of writing about sexuality, sex, things that have been relegated to the private sphere and making them into talking points, into political points, so therefore into points that people could organise around or could demand further rights or could demand a change of attitudes.
But at the same time, you not only observed this revolution, so-called, but also you practiced. You yourself have been writing a blog.
Yes, I did.
So what idea did you have behind it? Was it venting something or?
No, I wanted to be, I sort of wanted to be exactly the kind of diary person, the diary girl that I'm talking about.
So
it's quite funny now.
Carrie Bridget type.
Yes, I was an illustrator for about 15 years, and I started doing a visual diary. So it was a street diary. It was drawing people in the street, and I started writing more and more into it. So I'd draw street scenes. And then I'd kind of write down what people were saying, what was going on. But I found that the structure that I was giving them was a kind of, a kind of rom-com or screwball comedy structure. It was usually, something quirky happened. And I realised that there was a kind of rhetoric that I was organising events into, which was very much a kind of feminine form of writing from, writers of the early 20th century, like Anita Loos, who wrote Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. I was somehow helplessly sliding into this kind of very feminized role. And, this was like at least 15 years ago. I was just fascinated by what was happening there, and also the possibilities for putting things into this kind of telling that were perhaps kind of quite unusual, perhaps not expected of the genre.
That's true, but at the same time, you speak about it in the book. But I suppose it's important the context that you were becoming a mother. You just were trying to fit into the role, or I don't know. Just look at it in brackets, trying to examine what is your life going to be like. And I've thought that maybe going online as a girl gave you some kind of freedom from this role.
I mean, the girl figure, it's very controversial. Of course, many people are girls because of their age and sex and gender. So, this is entirely different from the idea of the girl as a kind of aspirational figure. Yeah. I work a lot with this text that I don't like very much, by the French collective Tikkun, called Notes Towards a Theory of the Young Girl, which is actually quite loathsome in many ways, because it identifies the figure of the young girl completely with capitalism. It doesn't say, she's a kind of war machine. There is no room there for queering, for autonomy within this role. And what the collective doesn't think about is they don't think about the real bodies and the real minds that are inhabiting these girl personas and what can be done about it. For them, the girl is inflexibly, there's no give and take between the girl and her real life flesh inhabitants. And of course, always everyone who, every model, every actress, every amateur blogger who is encountering this role, they're real people, and very often they're doing quite exciting and things within this role, which also combat this role. But when that's one of the very few opportunities for appearing in public, for gaining a public platform, then it's a choice that people make. Either you encounter that kind of identity and gain a larger platform and try to work from within it, or you reject it completely and possibly to try to find platforms elsewhere. But both. I wouldn't criticize either decision.
It's very interesting what you're saying. So what do you think about, let's say, phenomena like self-feminism, body positivity, sad girl theory? So being online, being a girl, but, subverting the gaze, being conscious of it, of your online body, so to say. Is it really working? Is it really working for women?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? I think I prefer the position to pre-on, because, I'm old enough to have grown up without the internet, without the ability to connect with people who were challenging any kind of normative views of my gender, sexuality, or, my place in the world. So to be honest, I am much happier with the internet, though of course I understand completely that it has hyped up pressures on, certain kinds of self-presentation and appearance. But for every, there are so many projects even within the platforms that seem very constraining. There are within Instagram, which seems particularly pernicious about asking people to inhabit so-called perfect versions of their lives. There are also many projects which subvert that. I wrote an essay that didn't go in the book about the Argentinian artist Amalia Ullman's excellences and perfections, in which she, in 2014, at the height of, the rise of the idea of the influencer, she took on the role on her personal Instagram of an influencer, started taking shots of herself with expensive designer bags and, in hotel rooms and in other glamorous places, implying that she was either being sponsored or, had some other means to suddenly access this wealth. Then staged a breakdown, which wasn't real, but I don't know how many people she told about this. I hope she told her family and close friends that this wasn't happening to her, and then emerged from this breakdown as a kind of wellness guru. So she said what she wanted to do was examine this triptych of girls online, the kind of the sugar baby influencer, and that's her words, sugar baby. The kind of the sad girl, the kind of damaged girl, and then the kind of the sort of Gwyneth Paltrow type, wellness lifestyle. I'm quite fascinated by. I have written an essay on Gwyneth Paltrow too, which is there was a great essay about her in was it the New York Times? Really, really fascinating.
Maybe we can find it later.
Anyway, you should find it. That kind of that sort of intense self-presentation is just very fascinating in itself. But anyway, the thing about Amalia Ullman's project that was so good, and she published a book. So even though it was ephemeral online, I have the book of the photographs. But alongside the photographs, she published all the comments she got on Instagram. And I think that's where the real art lies in these reactions, like the reactions I was just talking about to Catherine Sanderson's taking her so-called real life into the zone of a novel. So Ullman got a lot of exactly the sort of comments you expect on any heavily feminized Instagram blog. A lot of aspiration, so people saying, "Where do you get your hair done? How can I dress like you?" A lot of envy, sort of snide comments. A lot of direct trolling and aggression. A lot of concern trolling, and that the whole shocking range of how of how people culturally react to women staging themselves as ultra-feminine and staging themselves as successfully ultra-feminine is extraordinary.
It's really extraordinary. Actually, I'll tell you later about a Polish artist. She's from Krakow. Her name is Iwona Demko. You probably heard about her. And she's calling herself a feminist, and she's dressing in a pinky colors. And she's working in the academia, in the art world. And she's, on purpose wearing high heels and getting as girly as she possibly can be. And in her art, she's working with images or cultural stereotypes associated with women's bodies, especially vulvas, and using also textiles that are considered tacky, brocade and everything. And so it's very interesting. And she's also using Instagram. She invented this round in Polish. She called it a ugly selfie, and she's doing faces like that and putting it online. So and she also confessed that for her it was really something transgressive to put on an ugly face online.
Yeah, I think it's very important that the femme is separated necessarily from any essential ideas of gender or body, and that is really the way forward. Because if we identify certain styles exclusively with certain bodies, then we constrain those bodies to achieving these styles. I'm not very femme. I don't personally find it very comfortable. But the fact that some people, of any sex, of any gender, do want to be very femme also liberates me not to be.
Yeah, non-binary narrative. This is something that I want to talk about on the internet. Can it really exist? You have this beautiful theories in your book. I would like you to speak a bit about them. The tote bag story theory and the string bag story theory.
Well, the tote bag theory of fiction is Ursula Le Guin. Ursula Le Guin said she was sick of these linear stories in which a hero goes on a journey, they're like a kind of straight trajectory, goes on a journey, or maybe a kind of curved trajectory, goes on a journey, has a kind of battle or encounter, comes back and is successful. And, she said, for a start, this doesn't happen in my life. I don't have these kind of experiences, even modern equivalents of experiences. And also, she says, I don't really like the emphasis on violence here. She said that often anthropologists talk about the first tools as tools of cutting, so spears, knives, and tools of combat, so tools of hunting and combat. But she said, what if the first tool, in fact, was a receptacle? Because receptacles are so important. You can't collect water or food without a receptacle, which might be a kind of bag, a kind of bowl. So she said, what I want to see, instead of these linear stories which emphasize this experience that I'm just not having, and, I wouldn't say that, that this is the experience of the kind of alpha male. I wouldn't say that all men are having this experience either. Can't we have a carrier bag theory of fiction where we pick up things, we work with them non-hierarchically, so we can tell stories differently? And that's really affected the way that I think I was already working in that mode, because in my previous books, but when I read that, I thought this makes sense to me. What I want to do is I want to put a lot of things side by side and allow the reader to make some conclusions themselves. These will not, I felt like often I work rhythmically in a kind of dialectic structure, but it's not dialectic in a more traditional way in which there would just be 2 points of view intersecting with each other. I hope to work with a structure that's a little bit more rhizomatic. So it's where, like a root system, like that kind of Deleuze and Guattari root system, where you have all sorts of things next to each other developing. It makes me think of hyperlinked thinking. And I think I'm a bit of an internet native, although I grew up without the internet, because I love hyperlinked thinking. It's very natural to me to think, okay, I'm reading an article on this, but it's this word that I want to go to next. And I'm just going to Google it and see, or click on the link and see where it takes me. So I find that, therefore I found it as a writer quite difficult to structure my work in a linear thing like a book, where you do start at one end and you do finish at the other end. And a lot of my projects are about how do I get round that. And that's why I do a lot of internet hybrid projects. So I've done several digital narratives in which you don't need to read in a linear form. You can select the way that you go through my work. And sometimes you can interact and change it. But certainly you have your own path that appeals to you through the work. So you take your own kind of argument, and hopefully you get to visit a lot of the things that I've written. But it's like thinking with the reader. I like to think, to prompt a thought in the reader, and to think, and the reader thinks, yeah, I'm really interested in that bit. I'm going to hit on this word, highlighted word, or I'm going to take this path.
So it's like a reader player.
Yeah, I was very interested in those old choose your own adventure books. I mean, they're a little, of course, even with my online narratives, I find that they're quite constraining. It's my writing. I haven't yet done a project in which the reader can also write bits in, though maybe I'd like to sometime. But I did love the choose your own adventure books, because you feel like you're learning something about a way to navigate a narrative. And you go back and I quite like the way that you don't just read it once, you go back and then you do it a different way and you see how it'll work out differently. You see what if I was this kind of person? And it's a little bit like practical philosophy. There are some philosophy projects online where you can go through a philosopher's works and you can choose, or even, philosophical situations, and you can answer questions and you can see, well, did that scenario work out or not? If I go through a trolley problem, saying, if I pull the trolley lever, and then you go back and you see, how does it work out differently next time? So I've written a little essay like that on a website called miscommunication.ie, where I was thinking about gender and language again. And that's a choose your own adventure where you can just go anywhere you like through the kind of story. And they're very interesting to make. I think about making kind of nodes of meaning. So I've got little constellations of meaning over here and another one over here. And hopefully you kind of work a path through them, but you can leap between them.
I'm really fascinated by what you're saying because I wrote this virtual book or a book game book.
Oh, yeah.
And when you choose paragraphs and like waves, pathways through the book. And I think it's very liberating. But at the same time, I have this sacred quote that you also used in your book by Jean Didion. You know which one? That we tell ourselves stories in order to live. Yeah. And you're saying, actually, maybe no. Actually, maybe that's constraining. And I thought, well, maybe you're right. But what if everything is like Joanne put it, just destroyed and, without a center?
Yes.
Is it really a catastrophe or maybe it's something else?
Yes, well, Joan Didion, this is often used in inspirational websites, the Joan Didion quote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And it sounds very forward-facing and positive. But when you go to read that essay, which is the opening essay in her book, The White Album, you find that she's in a terrible situation. She's saying we see the sermon in the suicide, that we make up a nice story afterwards to justify what has happened. And this was her difficulty as a journalist. She said, at a certain point, I got to a point where none of this made sense anymore. I couldn't make the links. I couldn't create these stories anymore that would tell a nice story so that I could go on easily and feeling okay. So I think this is a point that we do. It's a good point that we have to confront. We have to think about whether the narratives that we've been given make sense to us or not. And this is where all my writing comes from. My writing really started from my personal situation, where I was in a situation where I thought, these narratives of how I should live, it's not happening. It's not making any sense to me. And I think I've been, sold a pup here, which is an English language expression. I think I've been told a lie in some ways, or a nice story, and it's just not happening. Maybe life has changed, maybe history has moved on, or maybe these things were never. Maybe these stories are never being told for my own good, like the diary story. Maybe the consigning some experience to privacy has actually been damaging for me, and there are whole traditions of literature which are devoted to uncovering the personal. It's really nice that Annie Ernaux won the Nobel Prize last week.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Because her work is all about that. She was a French writer. She's now aged about 80. She began writing relatively late in life. She wrote about her life, her parents' life. They were very, very ordinary lives. They were not dramatic. They were the sort of things that are usually considered too boring to be written about. They were normal experiences of growing up and quite dramatic experiences, such as trying to procure an abortion in France in the 1960s when it was illegal, but also more just more banal experiences, thinking back on her father. I'm just reading La Place, which is her thinking back on her father's life after his death and trying to make some sense of his kind of very unworded existence. He was a labourer and then he kept a cafe grocery. So he was a sort of person who would never write down his life. He probably wouldn't use kind of writing much in everyday life, even in running his business. But to think of accounting for that kind of life and accounting for normal lives, we need to tell different kinds of stories. Ernaux did say, I was reading a little bit in the beginning of the book, where she says, I started writing a novel about my father's life, but I found that the novel structure tempted me to be sentimental and to and this fictionalizing of his work over his life did not work. And so I went back and I thought, I want to write now just really plainly. I won't dramatize anything. I won't be emotional. And that's what her writing style is like. And I'll just write down what I know about my father in very plain terms. And that's been I think that is the key to her lifelong project, to bringing ordinary lives into tellability.
Yeah. totally agree. And for me as a reporter, someone who's writing nonfiction, the language that she is using so close to, the very material, the sensual in life, the now, here and now, so to say, the personal stories that all form this so-called big history, with a capital H, but we have all our personal histories worth telling. It's something really moving. But I also wanted to ask about another great concept that you're talking about, because we all know that there's history, right? There's also her story, and you have introduced the concept of shit story.
Yes, it's sort of history using the same letters but mixing them up a little. Yeah, I just thought, how do we account? Going back almost to now, how do we account for narratives that don't work out when our narratives don't seem to fit the right way to tell a story? They don't have happy endings. They don't have sad endings. They have difficulties that we can't account for, that are quite difficult to tell. It wasn't that everything was terrible, but things certainly weren't great. Things were complicated. There's a lovely bit. It's the way, again, that ordinary people's lives are suppressed. I'm going to find a little bit, if I can, from the British poet Anthony Varney Capildeo in an interview.
While you're looking through your book, I'm going to just quote the very beginning of the book when you're trying kind of to pinpoint what your book is about, but of course you're not telling anything through that. You're saying, this book is a user manual. This book is a virtual manifesto for manual workers. This book is a work of literary criticism. This book is a forum post. This book is a memoir of motherhood. This book is a historical novel about the internet in the 2000s. This book is a work of a feminist auto-theory. This book is a blog. This book is a thought experiment. This book is chiclet. This book is a piece of code. This book is art. I'm saying that.
Okay.
And also something that is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and it's my own opinion. I think that this kind of thought experiments are going to feed the narrative because, like you said, there's no future in repetition of the role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was really there thinking about the number of genres. If you think about the same writing under different genres, because writing is very much divided into genre and reviewed and sold according to genre, which can interfere very much with the way that it's seen. Certain genres don't get much attention, don't get much reviewing, but are often very popular. And you think, what can be done via those genres? And there's always been, I guess in the last sort of 20, 30 years, a big controversy about how women's literary fiction is categorized. For instance, Sally Rooney recently, there has been such a lot of discussion about, is this literary fiction or is it chick lit?
Maybe it's time that you also speak about Read Women,
Yes. So Read Women was a project that I ran from 2014 to 18. It was a Twitter-based project because I like running social media projects, and I basically ran them on Twitter because Twitter, I tried Instagram, but I just can't run things on several things at the same time. I've done some projects on Instagram, but they're much more visual. But what I like about Twitter is it is huge, and its networked ability of people to talk in public without knowing who is going to hear them, which makes it very different to networks where your network is closed or only open to invited friends. Of course, some people can make their Twitter account private, but that's a different thing. So I started an account. It was like I talk about in the book. In Girl Online, I have a little project which I've never done, where a friend who is an artist and I planned to go out into the street with her loudhailer. My friend has a loudhailer which she's used in various projects, and just repeat the names of women who are kind of borderline obscure in their area, mostly from arts, writing and tech, because that's what we know about, and also make little cards that we can hand out with just the names on. And that idea of presence a repetition as presence, and and what that does. There's a similar project which I really like called Girls on Tops, which is a t-shirt company, and they just have the name of women directors. Film directors. I have one. Mine is a Barbara Hammer one because I recently wrote an essay about Barbara Hammer, which I hope will go into my next book. But I like the fact that there's no context. They're just you see the name and you're expected to go off and find about it yourself, which is also where the internet comes in. So really, Rude Women started as a mentioning project. So it would just be mentioning and. I guess I want to find a different word from disseminating. The names of women writers who seem to have could do with better representation for whatever reason, or who had been forgotten or their names seemed not to be being preserved. So to mention them and their works and see where that took us. So I did that. It got quite big. I worked eventually with a few other people running who fed into the account, and it was really nice. What I like to do is projects where things go beyond the initial project themselves. So people were saying, "Can I do Read Women at this festival?" And I would have nothing to do with it, and I just said, "Yes, take the name. Use it to focus on women's writing. Use it to focus on overlooked writing, and writing that could do with more close examination, more bringing into the spotlight, into the canon." And this happened all over the place. There was a particularly good network in Brazil, which was entirely separate to mine, but they just said, we like what you're doing, can we do it? And I'm just like, yes, do it. And they set up a network of book clubs, thinking about how to bring, to think more seriously and more carefully about writing by women.
This is really great. This shared experience is, I think it's all about sisterhood and kind of spreading good ideas, not owning them. It's like mine, nobody can take it. Like being a bit like Sherpas climbing the Mount Everest together, waiting for each other. It's a bit like that.
Well, I think this is also where cyberfeminism comes in, because, the title of the event is Cyberfeminism. And I have done some work with cyberfeminist artists and communities, which was really started happening, I guess, in the late 80s and 90s, the first women online who were determined to make it something different from offline existence to make sure that women had more opportunities there. It's obviously now the internet is huge. The internet is our lives. And it didn't really work out like that. But it didn't really work out quite not like that either.
That's
very
true.
But that I hope to be carrying on their intentions, these kind of projects.
You are. I'll be asking a question, but while I'm doing that and Joanna's answering, I would love you to think about a question you would like to ask. Agata, of course, I'll ask you in a minute. So I'll ask my last question, or one of the last questions. It's about questions, because you're using this figure of Alice in Wonderland, Alice through the looking glass. And she's constantly asking questions. And I'm thinking about the presence that is a question on the internet. Yeah. Is it the most liberating presence for women? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love the idea of this kind of girl rhetoric in which women ask questions which are partially rhetorical. I also connect it with Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City, because I thought as a model of a diarist, I was very interested by the way she asks questions in her diaries. And the diary entry often ends with a question, but it doesn't end with an answer. So, at the end of each episode, it's like, and I couldn't help but wonder, what if so-and-so and so-and-so? And I thought, this is actually a very fruitful way to think. And it made me think of, there's this kind of thing in Greek philosophy called aporia, which I mentioned a little while ago, which is where people think up increasingly difficult questions.
Symposium and the City. Yes, you have this chapter. I love it.
Yes. they think up increasingly difficult questions to ask themselves and each other. And then they think about, okay, how do I feel about not being able to answer this question, or to be able to think about it a lot, but not find a satisfactory answer? And then they go on to experiment with this idea called ataraxia, I think it is, which is kind of being okay with not being okay. And I link that very much to the thought of the late Lauren Berlant, who only died a couple of years ago, American theorist, whose body of work was really how to survive in precarity. How do we get our heads around the fact that we're never going to get the American dream, which is, I think, was what they were working for. How can we feel that and take it on board and yet still act for a better world? And this question hopefully helps the kind of aporia, ataraxia kind of cycle. I hope creates a platform.
It just releases you from this binary.
It releases you from feeling you have to answer the question, that you have to achieve the good life, and this idea of irony, which comes into Judith Butler, and also the thought of Denise Riley, who's a poet and theorist from the UK, whose work is wonderful, as a way of working.
Agata, I'll bring you the mic. Oh, you have to. Okay.
Yes, I want to. I want to pose the question of female misery, actually.
Interesting.
Because at the beginning of your very interesting exchange, you mentioned Amelia Ullman?
Yeah.
No, sorry. Is she Amelia or?
Amalia.
Amalia Ullman, yes. And Sadger theory. And actually, I'm a quite prominent critic of this in Poland.
You are.
You might not. You can't be aware of this, but I actually wrote it like 5 years ago or something, like a critical text about it, which made rounds and kind of made some people to want to punch me in the street and so on.
You have a tendency to write like that, Agata. You have a tendency to write text like that, which is good, which is very good.
Hopefully, but I'm kind of start to be worried for my safety sometimes. But the question is with regard to women's writing, females' writing being associated quite often with this notion of authenticity, that somehow when women is writing, it's kind of expected almost that she is not writing fiction, but she's writing some kind of autobiography. And a lot of female writers were actually addressing that. And just like you, I love Annie Ernaux's writing and this kind of sort of detached, affectless, but at the same time very politicized and very personal type of writing. But at the same time, of course, in the recent, let's say, 10 or maybe more years, we had this quite a fashion for personal female writing, which also emerged from blogs, so to speak, and also from the cult around I Love Dick.
Yes.
Which you curiously haven't mentioned. Which you haven't mentioned, but I'm sure you had it at the end of your tone. Which book, I think, around probably 7-8 years ago, despite I think it was published
1997 originally.
Yes, quite a long time ago, but
I think it was around the time that there were there was certainly a new UK edition. It was the first time it was published in the UK about 8 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, so and it kind of made rounds again, and there was like a lot of young female writers online, especially on Twitter, who would sort of jump on that bandwagon. And quite opportunistically sometimes, I thought, because then again, some kind of a fetish of female misery would emerge.
Yeah, although I don't think I loved it.
I mean, I didn't ask my question yet.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, because from this we go to Sally Rooney.
Yes.
Which is a very interesting thing, because like she went viral, she went global, of course. And as I remember, when her first book, Conversation with Friends, was published and she got like a first huge coverage in New York Times, I think, she was pitched actually as an ambitious literature, first great millennial author, whatever. Like it was before she went global. Like really, she was this new thing. Conversation with Friends came out, which had this sort of interesting narrative structure because it's mostly built on dialogue and like how we exchange, how we communicate online a little bit. Yes, but the question is like, aren't you? What do you think about this sort of fetish? And all of the female characters in Sally Rooney are kind of unhappy young women. sometimes being cynical, but like the Frances from the first book, but very often I find that there is this kind of fetish for middle class, kind of unhappy girl who is like being abused, and this kind of talking about your abuse somehow becomes like a epitome of your authenticity. And like my question is, where are the alternative narratives of that? I mean, I Love Dick had this potential because the heroine of I Love Dick is like a female jackass. She like makes a fool of herself, and she's like open about it. It's not only about being miserable, but it's also about being funny, being having the courage to be laughed at, and all that. And I think that this element sort of kind of disappeared, and only the kind of over-intellectualized miserable girl was left. And yeah, well, I'm kind of asking, because I think that you are. What you're doing is kind of showing the alternative, perhaps, with this multi-level. But I want to ask you about the comment on this kind of fetish of female misery as authenticity, and this obsessing about authenticity of female experience.
It's really, really super interesting question. I think there was a little bit in the pieces I read where I talked about the first person industrial complex, and I did have a footnote to that, which I couldn't, it was too clunky to stop and read the footnote. So I was referring to an essay by Laura Bennett in 2015, which you can still go back and find online. I think it was in Slate, but don't hold me to that. And it was called First Person Industrial Complex. And it's quite a long essay about the previous 10 years of blogging, talking about exactly this, talking about the fact that publications found that confessional writing by women in which something bad happened, whether it was trivial or just very extreme, sold. And it sold very well. It was clickbait. And This was very sort of widely encouraged and commissioned, and Bennett talked about talking to Gia Tolentino, who was at the time working as an editor in, I'm not sure which online journal, and talking, interviewing her about her experience of commissioning one of these women and saying, "Are you sure you want this to be here? Because it's going to be here, it's going to be on the internet and it's going to be there forever. In 20 years, your family, if you have children by then or whatever, they're going to search it, and that's the thing they're going to find." So that kind of long consequences and probably very little pay is one side of it. The other side is it did allow a lot of writers who would never otherwise have had access to publication to be published and to start to think of themselves as writers and to start a writing practice. I think that includes me, although I came in through blogging, which is, if anything, the flip side of that, the trivialized, the kind of, the chick lit sort of side of it. So these are two sides to this kind of coin of female experience. Your experience is either trivialized, as with Petite Anglaise, where she was really writing about being in a very difficult situation, but it was all kind of funny and light, or at least it had those elements, and she was trying to kind of wrangle it somehow, it seemed, into the kind of chick lit story in which everything suddenly, and just like that, everything changed. So we've got these kind of these two very difficult areas in which women's experience has historically been organised, and yes, we do need to break out of those. I do think I Love Dick was an attempt to break out of that because it was both sad and funny because it was sad. Chris set herself up as a sort of, I think I called it, I wrote a piece about it when the new UK edition came out, and I called it slapstick tragedy as opposed to slapstick comedy, because it was, the situation was mildly tragic. I mean, it wasn't like tragic on a worldwide scale. It was it was someone who had a crush on her husband's colleague and made a complete fool of herself over it. And so it was kind of emotionally painful, but it was no more than that. It was, but it was within that. Chris wrote about, yes, it was Audrey Wallen who coined sad girl theory, but Chris was writing about lonely girl phenomenology, which is something a little bit different, which was really about her experience as a struggling artist in New York, without much money, trying to kind of, trying to kind of account for that experience. And yes, you can end up fetishizing that experience. And of course, it's been fetishized endlessly, particularly in literature about women, in novels about women, from Emma Bovary, Anna Karenina, any account of women's sadness. And yes, I am very tired of those accounts when they've been written by people who aren't struggling with that experience themselves, mainly men. But what I think it's always crucial what happens when someone who is going through that experience takes it, and this is where the kind of avowal of personal experience is interesting, and does something with it, because frankly, unless you're going to, and this is where the non-novelization, the kind of the auto-fiction, auto-theory comes in, because, frankly, if you're writing, you can't be miserable all the time. It's very difficult because writing is a very positive act, no matter that some people find it quite painful. I don't.
Agency, right?
Yeah, exactly. I found writing really a way to inject a sense of agency into a life which, when I started, didn't have. I was very much at the beck and call of others, and in a quite, sort of pinned position. But I was able to do that. But this, I think that is. I do ask the question: what happens when you avow that experience is truth? When you say this is actually a confession, even if you don't want to call it confessional literature. And I think what happens is you start demanding that your experience is not one-sided, and that it's not a sort of painting of a tragic heroine or a something in which there can be only one outcome. So I do think that there is the possibility there. I think the fetishization of sadness is certainly something that that exists, and people, because literature is only ever a slim bit of our lives. Even if we write a book, then it can only show a tiny bit of our lives, because our life is too big to go in a book. So it is possible for writers to only show, to say this is the truth and only show certain aspects of their lives. But I think it's much more difficult to do that in an experimental memoiristic situation than it is in a novelistic situation. Also, when you're writing autofiction, you encounter the fact that these things are forms. You think, okay, what genre am I going to put my life into, and what happens to the bits that don't fit, that I also want to talk about, that I also want to mention. So this is why I continue to find autofiction a radical solution, not only because it gives a few more strategies for writing about what has been unacceptable in other genres, but it also finds out what is unacceptable about genre and what is usable about genre, and how you can bring several genres in. And again, clash, make them talk to each other.
Of course, yeah, the patchwork method,
Yes.
ethnography also, I think, apart from the theory. But being practical, I have to approach the ending of this great conversation, but I think I owe you one more question. Someone from the audience maybe has a question, one more. Of course, you can ask questions afterwards, but I encourage you to be brave and formulate a reflection. It can also be a reflection or a thought. So if no one is raising their hands, I'll have the last question. Okay. It's a quote by you from an interview. And I chose it because it's very interesting, for me at least. I'm a writer, but I think it's not only interesting for people who write. Generally, it's interesting for people who think, I think. It's a piece of advice for writers. I guess my advice is define carefully what makes you uncomfortable and dwell in this difficulty. Find ways to enjoy it. No, that is writing advice, not advice how to get published.
Yes. Yeah, I teach in university.
Yeah, creative writing.
I teach creative writing, and also I teach multidisciplinary creativity, writing, whatever.
Great.
But I always find with students, I can tell when they hand me a manuscript and there's a place where they have missed something out. And it's usually a place where they find it difficult to go. You know, it might be for personal reasons. It might be I don't want to expose myself here. It might be I don't want to expose what happened with, you know, my father, my sister, my children. So I find that when these are skipped over, I can always tell, and it makes the manuscript quite unsatisfying. And I think any reader can tell. Any reader will not necessarily be able to pinpoint it, but will be able to tell that there's something not happening here. And so I always ask them to, if I can see that happening, ask them to kind of go away privately and write what it is that they didn't want to write. They don't have to show me. And then think about, often they discuss it with me, they're happy to discuss the point that they're not talking about, but they don't want to write it. And then think about ways that they can write about it, including ways that they can write about not wanting to write about something, or ways that they can write about having an uncomfortable thing that they want to mention. But I find that unsuccessful manuscripts for me are ones that want to conclude too rapidly, or to go, you know, either tragically or comically, either, you know, to a good ending or a bad ending. Those are both equally unsatisfying. I'm very interested really in writing with us dealing, you know, it can be through fiction, it can be through fantasy fiction. It's all the same, but, you know, you don't have to be writing exactly what your life is like to encounter these kind of difficulties. But if you don't encounter these, if you're writing about certain subjects, then there's just a feeling of incompleteness if these things aren't properly explored. So I just think any writer, the first thing you should do is you go to the bits that you don't want to write, and don't necessarily write about them straight away, but just be aware that they're there. It's like having a kind of like little, you know, you're just sitting on a chair and there's a little lump in it, and you're always aware of it. And it's okay. You just have to acknowledge that in some way. You have to deal with it. It doesn't have to be the main subject of your writing, but it can be so fruitful to think, even if it's quite a trivial thing, it might not be the thing that's bugging you might not be the kind of massive thing in your life where somebody died or something terrible happened to you. It might be something else, but through kind of sitting with that and exploring it, you can come to find some very interesting things that interest you. It's all about to pay attention to the things that are uncomfortable, is to pay attention to things that really interest you. And then you find a way around talking about them.
I think it's very interesting, kind of, it's telling this fable about the princess, you know, lying on cushions.
Princess of the Pea.
Yeah, and in an empowering way, because, you know, it's noticing the uncomfortable thing.
Yes. Well, this is like, I was talking about Sarah Ahmed, and she talks a lot about discomfort and discomfort with where you're sitting. She talks about sitting at the table and finding a place at the table, and the difficulty of remaining at the table when you know that your experience is going to be annoying and your mere presence is going to be annoying to some people.
We could talk for hours, I think. And I do hope that you are going to experience Girl Online as a book and other books by Joanna Walsh, and who is also a critic, an editor, an artist, a campaigner, an activist, and so on. So, and I think it's the only way to function in this world when you have to just be creative, because when you're not, they're going to put you into a role and just
by the way,
cookie cutter.
There are no physical books. If anyone wants me to sign a postcard or something, and then you can put it in the book later, I'm very happy to just do that place-holding thing.
So leaving the author here, and thank you so very much for coming. My name is Karolina Sulej, and I had this privilege of a conversation with Joanna Walsh. Bravo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.